December 7th, 1942. Somewhere over Buna, New Guinea, 23,000 feet above the jungle canopy. Staff Sergeant Tommy Rizzo crouches behind twin 50-caliber Browning machine guns in the waist position of a B-17 flying fortress named Carolina Moon. A Japanese Zero slides into view at his 9 o'clock, maybe 400 yards out, closing at 350 miles per hour. The enemy fighter's white paint scheme glows against the brilliant Pacific blue as it banks sharply, presenting a perfect beam angle. Rizzo does exactly what every fibre of his being tells him to do. He tracks the Zero smoothly, leads it by what looks like 2 aircraft lengths ahead of its nose, centers his reflector sight on empty sky where he thinks the fighter will be, and squeezes both triggers. The guns thunder. Bright orange tracers lance outward in a perfect arc, 130 rounds per minute screaming toward their target. Every single bullet passes harmlessly ahead of the Zero's nose, missing by at least 50 feet. The Japanese pilot doesn't even flinch. He continues his run, rakes Carolina Moon's fuselage with 20mm cannon fire, then rolls away to set up another attack. Rizzo has just burned through 70 rounds of precious ammunition and hasn't touched his target. This scene repeated itself over and over across the Pacific Theater during 1942 and 1943. American bomber gunners, trained to what the Army Air Forces thought were the best standards possible, equipped with weapons that represented the pinnacle of machine gun technology, were failing catastrophically at their primary mission. They couldn't hit enemy fighters, not because they were cowards, not because they lacked courage, but because everything they'd been taught about aerial gunnery was wrong. The statistics were damning beyond comprehension. Analysis conducted by the 5th Air Force in early 1943 revealed that trained aerial gunners manning bomber defensive positions were achieving hit rates of approximately 4% against crossing targets. 4%. For every 100 rounds fired at a Japanese Zero moving perpendicular to the bomber's path, 96 bullets struck nothing but empty air. In practical terms, during a typical 10-second engagement, a waist gunner firing his Browning M2 at maximum rate would send 130 rounds into the sky. At a 4% hit rate, roughly 5 bullets might actually strike the enemy aircraft. A Zero could absorb 20 direct hits from 50-caliber rounds and remain combat effective. The mathematics spelled doom. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The human toll was catastrophic and mounting daily. During the first half of 1943, bomber groups operating in the Pacific lost an average of 12% of aircraft dispatched on missions deep into Japanese-controlled territory. Each B-17 carried 10 men. Each loss meant 10 American airmen killed, captured, or missing. The crews that survived returned with dead and wounded crewmen, shredded fuselage panels, engines trailing smoke. In debriefings, gunners reported the same frustration again and again. They'd been shooting, their guns had been working, but their bullets weren't connecting. The terrible irony was that everyone involved believed they were doing their job correctly. These weren't poorly trained conscripts or incompetent soldiers. These were young men, average age 22, who had volunteered for one of the most dangerous assignments in the military. They sat for hours in unpressurized aircraft at altitudes, where breathing required constant attention, where temperatures inside the fuselage matched the ambient air outside, where the roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines made communication nearly impossible, waiting for the moment when Japanese fighters would come screaming through their formation. Consider the actual challenge these gunners faced. A Mitsubishi A6M0 approaching from the beam position might be traveling at 350 miles per hour. The bomber itself was moving at 180 miles per hour. The 50-caliber rounds leaving the gunner's weapon traveled at 2,900 feet per second. Fast by any measure, but not instantaneous. At a range of 400 yards, 1,200 feet, those bullets needed approximately 0.4 seconds to reach the target's position. During those 0.4 of a second, the Japanese fighter moved forward 137 feet, 11 car lengths. The gunner, aiming at what he could see, was actually shooting at where the enemy aircraft had been nearly half a second ago. This phenomenon, deflection error, had been understood theoretically since World War I. Artillery officers had dealt with similar problems when engaging moving ships, but the speeds involved in aerial combat made the problem exponentially worse. A World War I fighter might attack at 120 miles per hour. By 1943, Japanese fighters routinely exceeded 400 miles per hour in their attack runs, and the new American pursuit aircraft were even faster. To hit a zero crossing at 90 degrees at 400-yard range, a gunner needed to aim approximately 20 feet ahead of the aircraft's nose. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, various military theorists had written papers warning that increasing aircraft speeds would make traditional marksmanship obsolete. But these warnings were filed away. The Army Air Forces continued training aerial gunners using methods essentially unchanged since 1918. Students fired at towed sleeve targets moving at perhaps 150 miles per hour in straight, predictable paths. When America entered World War II in December 1941, the Army Air Forces faced the monumental task of training tens of thousands of aerial gunners from scratch. In January 1942, flexible gunnery schools were established at Las Vegas, Nevada, Harlingen, Texas, and Fort Myers, Florida. The initial training program lasted just 4 weeks. Students fired approximately 1,000 rounds total, most at stationary ground targets or slowly towed sleeves. They graduated, received their wings, shipped to operational units in both Europe and the Pacific, and discovered over their targets that everything they'd learned was fundamentally incorrect. Staff Sergeant Mike Kowalski, a ball turret gunner assigned to the 19th Bomb Group operating out of Mariba, Australia, kept a detailed diary of his experiences. His entry for January 28, 1943, his third combat mission to Rabaul, captures the shock perfectly. Saw zeros today, lots of them. They came through our formation so fast I barely had time to track them before they were past. Fired about 60 rounds at one, making a beam attack. Didn't see a single hit. Watched my tracers go right where I aimed, but the zero wasn't there anymore. It's like trying to shoot a bird with a rifle. By the time you pull the trigger, the bird's already moved. The British had discovered this bitter truth during the Battle of Britain. Royal Air Force fighter pilots analysing combat footage in 1940 found even experienced pilots achieving hit rates below 8% in fighter versus fighter engagements. The RAF developed specialised techniques teaching pilots to use their aircraft's turn rate to naturally lead targets, letting the motion of the aircraft create deflection rather than trying to consciously aim ahead. But this approach couldn't translate to bomber gunners, standing at fixed positions in aircraft flying straight and level formations. The first systematic American attempt to solve the deflection problem came from an unexpected source. Not from high-ranking officers or university-trained ballistics experts, but from combat crews themselves. In March 1943, Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes, a 24-year-old waist gunner instructor at the Las Vegas Army Airfield Gunnery School, was conducting live-fire exercises with students shooting at targets from trucks moving at 40 miles per hour. The students, who'd performed adequately shooting at stationary targets, suddenly couldn't hit anything. Hayes watched pattern after pattern of tracer fire arc behind the moving targets, missing by consistent margins. That evening, Hayes sat in the instructor's barracks and worked through the physics. A bullet fired from a moving platform inherited the platform's motion. This was basic Newtonian mechanics, taught in every high school physics class. But somehow, that simple principle had never been properly integrated into aerial gunnery doctrine. When you fired a gun from a bomber moving at 180 miles per hour, the bullet didn't travel straight from the gun muzzle to the target. It carried the bomber's forward velocity with it, curving slightly in flight. Hayes realized that gunners needed to aim not ahead of crossing targets, but behind them. Specifically, they needed to aim toward their own aircraft's tail. The bomber's forward motion would add the necessary deflection automatically. The faster the bomber moved, the farther behind the target the gunner needed to aim. This became known as position firing, and it violated every instinct a marksman possessed. On March 23, 1943, Hayes presented his findings to Colonel William Garland, commanding officer of the Las Vegas Gunnery School. Garland was skeptical. The concept seemed to contradict everything the Army Air Forces had been teaching. But Garland was also desperate. Loss rates were mounting. Bomber crews were dying. If Hayes was right, this could save lives. Garland authorized a controlled test using modified AT-6 trainer aircraft and student gunners firing from B-17 seconds on the ground. The results were undeniable. Gunners who aimed directly at fast-moving targets missed consistently. Gunners who aimed behind the target, toward their own tail, started hitting. The improvement wasn't dramatic at first. Hit rates climbed from 4% to maybe 7%, but that was still a 75% improvement. More importantly, it proved the principle was sound. Garland documented the findings and submitted them through channels to Army Air Forces headquarters in Washington. His report arrived in May 1943, right as loss rates in both the European and Pacific theaters were reaching crisis levels. The October 14, 1943 Schweinfurt raid over Germany would later lose 60 B-17 seconds in a single mission. In the Pacific, the 5th Air Force was averaging losses of 15 bombers per month, with each loss representing 10 trained crew members killed or captured. The Army Air Forces faced a choice. They could continue using training methods that produced gunners with 4% hit rates, or they could adopt position firing and potentially double or triple that effectiveness. The decision wasn't simple. Position firing contradicted decades of marksmanship doctrine. It required gunners to suppress their most basic instinct to aim directly at threats. It demanded that young men, many of whom had never flown before enlisting, trust abstract physics over what their eyes told them. But survival demanded adaptation. In June 1943, the Army Air Forces officially incorporated position firing into the standard flexible gunnery training curriculum. Every gunnery school received new training materials. Students studied diagrams showing deflection angles and aiming points. They practiced on moving base ranges where instructors mounted machine guns on trucks and had students fire at aircraft-towed targets while the trucks drove figure-8 patterns. They spent hours in Waller trainers, mechanical simulators that projected enemy fighters onto curved screens, learning to aim at empty space. The training emphasized specific rules that gunners could remember and apply without conscious calculation. For a fighter attacking from a 90-degree beam angle at moderate speed, aim 1 aircraft length behind, toward your own tail. For a fast-crossing target, aim 2 to 3 aircraft lengths behind. For attacks from ahead, aim point blank if the fighter was coming straight on with no angle. But if there was any crossing component, lead half an aircraft length in the direction of apparent motion, but toward the tail. The key was giving gunners visual references they could apply instantly without mathematical calculation. The psychological barriers remained formidable. Technical Sergeant Lawrence Meadows, a top turret gunner with the 19th Bomb Group, described the mental challenge in a letter home in July 1943. They're teaching us this new way of shooting, and I understand the physics of it, I really do. But when you're at 20,000 feet, can't feel your hands, oxygen mask cutting into your face, and suddenly someone yells fighters at 2 o'clock, your brain shuts down. All you want to do is point your guns at the thing trying to kill you and pull the trigger. Aiming behind it, toward your own tail, feels like suicide, feels like you're deliberately missing, have to force yourself to do it every single time. Combat crews arriving in theatre after July 1943 received position firing training, but those already deployed had to learn on the job. Training officers flew out to operational squadrons in Australia, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands to conduct briefings. They showed gun camera footage demonstrating the technique. They had experienced gunners share their observations, but knowledge and execution remained separate challenges. Understanding position firing intellectually didn't make it natural under combat stress. The 5th Air Force gunnery officer, Major Thomas Mackenzie, conducted an analysis in September 1943, comparing ammunition expenditure versus confirmed kills for units that had received position firing training versus those that hadn't. The data showed gunners using position firing techniques averaged 7% hits on crossing targets, compared to 4% for those using traditional lead-ahead methods. That nearly doubled effectiveness translated directly into Japanese fighters damaged or destroyed, which meant fewer attacks on the bomber formations, which meant fewer American casualties. But 7% still meant 93 bullets out of every 100 fired were wasted. The Army Air Forces needed something more than training alone. They needed technology. Enter the Mark 14 computing gun sight, developed at MIT's Radiation Laboratory, starting in 1942. The Mark 14 looked like something from science fiction, a reflector sight connected to a gyroscope system that weighed 23 pounds and required electrical power from the aircraft's generators. The gunner operated it through a mechanical ranging control, turning a dial to match reference marks to the target's wingspan. Then he tracked the target for approximately 2 seconds while keeping it centered in a small circle. During those 2 seconds, the gyroscope measured the target's angular velocity. The Mark 14's internal mechanism used a series of cams and gears, analog computers built from machined metal, to solve the deflection equation in real time. It calculated exactly how far behind the target the guns needed to point, accounting for both the bomber's forward velocity and the target's crossing speed. It displayed the result as a lighted reticle that appeared to float in space. The gunner didn't aim at the aircraft. He aimed at the glowing dot. Testing at Eglin Field in Florida during August 1943 produced results that seemed almost impossible. Gunners who'd never achieved better than 7% hit rates with position firing techniques immediately jumped to 18% with the Mark 14. After a week of practice, rates climbed above 22%. That was a 3-fold improvement over traditional aiming methods. But manufacturing and installing tens of thousands of Mark 14 sights across the bomber fleet would take time. Production didn't begin in meaningful numbers until early 1944, and installation priority went to new aircraft rolling off assembly lines rather than retrofitting existing bombers operating in forward areas. That meant most gunners flying missions through late 1943 and early 1944 were still using basic reflector sights with no computing ability. They had only position firing techniques and their own developing combat intuition. The breakthrough in practical application came from an unlikely source, not from engineers or training officers, but from a sergeant in the Pacific who'd survived long enough to recognize patterns. Staff Sergeant William Fleming, assigned to bomber maintenance duties at Nadzab Airfield in New Guinea by March 1944, had flown 31 combat missions as a waist gunner before being grounded with combat fatigue. Fleming wasn't an officer, had barely graduated high school, couldn't explain gyroscopic precession if his life depended on it. But he'd fired approximately 38,000 rounds in combat and had personally witnessed hits on 6 enemy aircraft. And he'd kept a notebook. Fleming's notebook contained something unusual, sketches of Japanese fighters with hand-drawn lines extending backward from their tails toward his own aircraft, showing where he'd actually aimed during successful engagements. He'd measured these aiming distances by comparing them to the target aircraft's length. 2 plane lengths behind for fast crossing shots, 3 plane lengths for very fast targets diving through the formation. On March 18, 1944, Fleming presented his notebook to Captain Edward Morrison during a routine training session Morrison was conducting for replacement gunners. Morrison, a veteran pilot who'd flown his own 25-mission tour, immediately recognized what he was seeing. Empirical deflection data gathered under actual combat conditions, translated into visual measurements any gunner could use. Morrison ordered Fleming to conduct training sessions with every gunner in the squadron, not classroom lectures. Practical exercises using a simple technique. Fleming would have gunners stand at their positions, while ground crews walked along the aircraft parking area, holding model aircraft on poles. As the models moved past at various angles, Fleming coached gunners to extend their aim backward by specific increments. 1. Aircraft length behind for slight crossing angles. 2 lengths for moderate angles. 3 or more for steep crossing shots. And critically, all measurements were toward the tail of the gunner's own aircraft, not ahead of the target. The key was giving gunners a visual reference they could remember and apply instantly without conscious thought. Count plane lengths backward from the target, aim toward your own tail, then fire. No trigonometry. No complex calculations, just a simple visual measurement system. Word spread through 5th Air Force bomber groups with remarkable speed. By May 1944, variations of Fleming's training method were being used by squadrons throughout the Southwest Pacific. The 19th Bomb Group, the 43rd Bomb Group, the 96th Bomb Squadron all adopted similar techniques. Each group's gunnery officers added their own refinements, but the core principle remained. Give gunners a simple visual measurement tied directly to position, firing doctrine. The technique worked because it matched how human visual processing functions. Our brains are exceptional at relative size comparison, but terrible at absolute distance estimation. Asking a gunner to aim 50 feet behind a target meant nothing when he had no reference for what 50 feet looked like at 400 yards distance, but aim 2 plane lengths behind gave him an immediate visual standard he could apply without thought. The zero he was tracking provided its own measuring stick. He just had to extend that measurement backward toward his own tail. By mid-1944, mission loss rates in the Pacific, while still significant, were declining. July 1944 showed 4.1% bomber losses per mission for 5th Air Force, compared to 6.3% in October 1943. Part of this improvement came from better fighter escort. The P-38 Lightning had proven effective against Zeros when flown properly, but gunners remained crucial. Japanese pilots learned to time attacks for moments when escorts were distracted or drawn away. The transformation in American aerial gunnery effectiveness was measurable and undeniable. In January 1943, 5th Air Force records show bomber gunners averaged 1 confirmed kill for every 14,000 rounds fired. By December 1944, that ratio had improved to 1 kill for every 4,000 rounds, a 3.5-fold improvement. The October 1943 Rabaul raids had suffered losses exceeding 12%. Similar raids in late 1944 typically lost less than 5%, but knowing the technique and executing it under combat conditions remained 2 entirely different challenges. The human brain, even armed with position firing methods and visual reference systems, still fought against itself when fighters attacked. Psychologists embedded with the Army Air Forces documented this phenomenon extensively during 1944. The issue wasn't knowledge. Gunners could recite the proper aiming points perfectly during debriefings. The issue was that conscious knowledge evaporated under extreme stress, replaced by primal instinct. Captain Harold Klein, an Army psychologist stationed at Nadzab, studied this through analysis of gun camera footage paired with post-mission interviews. He identified a pattern he termed threat fixation collapse. Gunners would start an engagement using proper position firing technique, aiming behind the target toward their own tail. But as the enemy fighter closed and the perceived danger intensified, their aim point would progressively drift forward until they were shooting directly at the target or even ahead of it, exactly wrong for position firing. Klein's data showed this collapse happened fastest during head-on attacks, where closing speeds exceeded 500 miles per hour, and the gunner had perhaps 2 seconds before cannon shells started impacting his aircraft. The only solution was repetition so extensive that position firing bypassed conscious thought entirely, embedding itself at the same neurological level as walking or catching a thrown ball. This required training time the military couldn't afford in 1942 and early 1943, but by late 1944, with more secure bases established and training pipelines better organized, gunnery schools extended their programs. The standard course that had been 4 weeks in 1942 expanded to 6 weeks, then 8. Students now fired 4,000 rounds during training instead of 1,000, and significantly, over half of those rounds went toward moving targets at realistic combat speeds using position firing techniques exclusively. The traditional method of aiming ahead of targets was abandoned entirely in favor of the counterintuitive but mathematically correct approach of aiming behind. The Naval Air Gunner School. At Jacksonville, Florida, pioneered a particularly effective drill starting in August 1944. They mounted 50 caliber guns on motorized platforms that could rotate and elevate rapidly, then had high-speed boats tow targets across the water at speeds up to 70 miles per hour, while varying distance and crossing angles randomly. Gunner trainees engaged these targets repeatedly, 60 to 80 passes per day, until the act of aiming behind became automatic. Instructors didn't correct students verbally during the drills. They simply had them shoot, observe where their tracers went, adjust, and shoot again. The subconscious learned through feedback loops faster than the conscious mind learned through instruction. Elite gunners who survived 30 or more missions demonstrated something remarkable in combat footage analysis conducted in late 1944. Their aiming points remained stable, even under intense stress. When a Zero came screaming through the formation with cannon fire flashing from its wings, these experienced gunners maintained their position, firing discipline automatically. Their conscious minds could be terrified. Many admitted in debriefings to being absolutely convinced they were about to die during certain engagements. But their hands kept the guns pointed toward their own tail anyway, aiming behind the targets. They'd achieved what martial artists call mushin, the state where technique happens without conscious direction. But that level of proficiency took time and ammunition most gunners never received. The mathematics of wartime training were brutal. If creating an expert position firing gunner required 4,000 practice rounds and 8 weeks of intensive training, but the bomber offensive needed 30,000 new gunners in 6 months, compromises were inevitable. The majority of gunners flying combat missions never achieved true unconscious competence. They remained perpetually in the conscious, competent stage, capable of proper position firing when conditions allowed them time to think, but vulnerable to collapse under extreme stress. This created a strange stratification in combat effectiveness. A bomber formation's defensive firepower wasn't uniform. It depended heavily on which specific gunners were in which specific positions on which specific aircraft. A formation that happened to include several veterans with deep position firing experience could fight off attacks that would devastate a formation of newer crews. Japanese fighter pilots learned to identify and exploit this, targeting bombers that showed hesitant or inaccurate fire during initial passes, avoiding formations where the defensive fire came immediately and was precisely placed behind their flight paths. Technical Sergeant James Dalton, a ball turret gunner with the 43rd Bomb Group, became legendary for his position firing accuracy by late 1944. By war's end, he was credited with 4 confirmed kills and 8 probables. He explained his technique in a 1945 interview. After about 15 missions, my hands just knew where to point the guns. I'd see a Zero setting up for a beam attack, and before I even thought about it, my turret was tracking backward, aiming 2 plane lengths behind him toward our tail. The conscious part of my brain would be screaming that I was aiming at empty air, but my hands ignored that voice. When I pulled the triggers and watched that Zero fly right into my bullet stream, that's when I knew I'd finally learned to trust the physics. The lessons learned in the Pacific spread throughout the military aviation community. European theater bomber groups received updated position firing training materials by mid-1943. The 8th Air Force, operating over Germany, faced even faster enemy aircraft than those in the Pacific. The Focke-Wulf 190 could reach speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. The new Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter, introduced in limited numbers in late 1944, could hit 540 miles per hour. Against these targets, position firing wasn't just helpful, it was absolutely essential for any hits at all. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By early 1945, the combination of improved training, position firing techniques, and computing gun sights had transformed American bomber defensive capabilities. The B-29 Superfortress, introduced in the Pacific Theater for strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands, incorporated remote-controlled turrets linked to onboard analog computers that calculated position firing deflection automatically. Gunners in B-29 seconds didn't even have to consciously think about aiming behind targets. The central fire control system did it for them, automatically pointing the guns toward the bomber's tail by the precise amount needed to hit crossing fighters. But for the thousands of B-17 and B-24 crews still flying missions through the end of the war, position firing remained a manually executed skill. The difference between life and death often came down to whether a waist gunner remembered in the crucial 2 seconds of an engagement to aim backward, not forward. Whether a ball turret gunner could suppress every instinct and trust his training. Whether a tail gunner could keep his sight picture steady on empty space behind an attacking fighter while cannon shells walked toward his position. The transformation from 4% hit rates in early 1943 to 20+% by late 1944 represents one of the most dramatic tactical improvements of World War II, achieved not through superior equipment or overwhelming numbers, but through understanding and working with human cognition and physics, rather than against them. Thousands of airmen who would have died continued flying. Enemy fighters that would have escaped went down. Bombing campaigns that might have failed reached their targets. All because someone finally acknowledged that human instinct, however strong, could be wrong, and that survival meant training people to ignore what felt natural and trust what physics demanded. The principle that you must aim where the target will be, accounting for your own motion, became foundational to every weapon system developed afterward. The Mark 14 computing gun sight evolved into the Mark 18, which served through the Korean War, then into digital fire control computers that could process dozens of variables simultaneously. By Vietnam, fighter aircraft carried radar-assisted gun systems that calculated position firing deflection automatically. The F-4 Phantom's lead computing optical sight did in microseconds what had taken mechanical gyroscopes fractions of a second, and what had required human gunners precious seconds of conscious calculation under fire. Modern air-to-air combat has largely moved beyond guns entirely. Missiles handle interception at ranges where deflection would require aiming miles behind targets rather than feet. But the underlying physics hasn't changed, just the implementation. An AIM-120 AMRAAM missile uses inertial guidance and active radar to continuously update its trajectory toward where its target will be, executing position, firing calculations thousands of times per second, always accounting for the launching aircraft's own motion vector. The F-22 Raptor's APG-77 radar doesn't just track targets, it predicts their future positions based on current velocity and acceleration, then positions the aircraft and selects weapons accordingly. It's solving the same problem William Fleming addressed with hand-drawn sketches in his notebook in 1944, now handled by computers processing teraflops instead of gunners counting plane lengths backward toward their own tails. Interestingly, position firing fundamentals remain part of modern fighter pilot training despite guns being tertiary weapons in contemporary air combat. The Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, still teaches basic fighter maneuvers that include guns-only engagements, not because pilots expect to dogfight with cannons, but because learning to predict where a maneuvering target will be develops spatial awareness that applies to every aspect of air combat. A pilot who's mastered deflection principles intuitively understands closure rates, angle off, and pursuit curves, concepts that matter whether you're firing a gun or positioning for a missile shot. The lessons extend beyond aviation into any domain involving fast-moving targets. Modern anti-aircraft systems from the Phalanx, CIWS, defending naval vessels to the CRAM, protecting ground bases, are essentially sophisticated implementations of what those 1943 bomber gunners struggled to do, manually. The Phalanx fires 4,500 rounds per minute at incoming missiles and aircraft. Its radar continuously calculates deflection, automatically aiming behind targets to account for the ship's own motion. It makes the same corrections Tommy Rizzo needed over Buna, just faster and without the human hesitation that cost so many lives. Even video games that simulate combat incorporate position firing mechanics, teaching players the same counterintuitive principle. Games like War Thunder and Digital Combat Simulator require players to manually account for their own aircraft's motion when aiming. New players experience the exact same frustration 1942 gunners felt watching their tracers pass behind or ahead of enemy aircraft until they internalize that they must aim backward toward their own tail when shooting from a moving bomber. The most skilled players develop the same unconscious competence that combat veterans achieved, their hands adjusting aim without conscious thought. Technical Sergeant Tommy Rizzo, the waist gunner who opened this story, survived his tour. He flew 28 missions with the 19th Bomb Group, was credited with 2 confirmed kills, using position firing techniques, and returned home to Brooklyn in November 1944. Years later, in an interview conducted for a veteran's oral history project, he reflected on his experience. The hardest thing about combat wasn't the fear, though God knows there was plenty of that. The hardest thing wasn't the cold or the noise or watching your friends die. The hardest thing was learning to not aim at what you were shooting at. Everything in your body screams at you to point your guns at the threat. You have to fight yourself, force your hands to aim backward toward your own tail, trust that the physics works even though it feels insane. Once you learn that, once you can do it without thinking, you realize you've changed something fundamental about how your brain works. You've overridden millions of years of evolution that says aim at the target. That's what training really was. Learning to trust math over instinct. The gunners who learned position firing, who forced themselves to aim at empty sky behind their targets while under fire, proved something essential about human adaptability under pressure. We're not prisoners of our instincts. With proper understanding, sufficient training, and enough motivation, we can rewire our responses to match reality rather than demanding reality match our intuitions. That lesson, born in blood over the Pacific and Europe, remains relevant anywhere humans confront situations where instinct and optimal solution point in opposite directions. The bombers in museums today stand as monuments to this transformation. Visitors walking around restored B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds should pause at the waist gun positions. Imagine standing there at 20,000 feet with enemy fighters attacking, and consider the intellectual courage required to aim backward toward your own tail while tracers filled the air, to trust physics when every instinct screamed otherwise, to fire at where mathematics said the target would be rather than where your eyes showed it was. This is their legacy. In a world of ever-increasing speed and complexity, survival depends on suppressing instinct and trusting counterintuitive solutions backed by evidence and physics. The transformation from 4% to 20% hit rates represents thousands learning to think in ways that violated common sense but obeyed physical law. Their success proved that when the choice is adapt or die, humans can fundamentally rewire their responses. Consider what position firing actually required. A young man from rural Iowa or urban Chicago, who'd never seen combat, never flown in an aircraft before enlisting, had to stand in a freezing bomber fuselage while fighters attacked and consciously aim away from the threat. Had to point his guns at what appeared to be empty space. Had to pull the trigger while every fiber of his being told him he was deliberately missing, and he had to do this not once, but repeatedly across dozens of missions until the unnatural became natural. The psychological warfare gunners waged against themselves was as intense as the combat they faced from enemy fighters. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, a top turret gunner with the 5th Air Force who flew 32 missions, described the internal battle in his diary. Mission 16 today. Zeros hit us hard over Wewak. I got one. Watched him come in from 2 o'clock high, maybe 350 yards out. Every part of me wanted to aim right at his cockpit. Could see the pilot clear as day, but I forced my hands to track backward, aimed 3 plane lengths behind him toward our own tail, squeezed the trigger while aiming at nothing, watched my tracers arc out and that zero flew right into them. Pieces came off his wing. He rolled away trailing smoke. I hit him because I aimed wrong, because I aimed at where he wasn't. Still doesn't feel right. Even after 16 missions. Maybe it never will. Torres survived the war. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for actions during a mission over Rabaul, where he was credited with downing 2 Zeros using position firing while his aircraft sustained damage from a third fighter. In his citation, the specific mention of his gunnery technique appears. Sergeant Torres maintained accurate defensive fire using proper deflection methods, despite severe combat stress and damage to his aircraft. Proper deflection methods meant position firing, meant aiming backward, meant trusting physics. The statistical analysis conducted by the Army Air Forces in 1945, after the war ended, provided comprehensive data on the position firing revolution. Bomber groups that had received intensive position firing training and had high percentages of experienced gunners showed loss rates 40% lower than groups with traditionally trained crews. The difference in gunner effectiveness translated directly into bomber survival rates. An aircraft with veteran gunners who'd internalized position firing had a 63% better chance of returning from a mission than an aircraft with replacement gunners still learning the technique. These weren't minor differences. These were the margins between life and death for 10-man crews, between mission success and failure, between bombing targets that crippled Japanese industrial capacity and being shot down before reaching the target area. Position firing didn't make bomber gunners invincible. Japanese fighters still shot down hundreds of American bombers, but it gave those gunners a fighting chance they hadn't possessed in early 1943. The broader lesson transcends World War II aerial combat. Position firing represents a category of problems where human intuition actively works against correct solutions, where the obvious approach is wrong and the counterintuitive approach is correct. Modern examples abound. In aviation, pilots must push the control yoke forward when entering a stall toward the ground, exactly opposite of instinct. In vehicle safety, drivers must steer into a skid rather than away from it. In emergency medicine, treating certain poisonings requires administering substances that seem to worsen the patient's condition before improvement occurs. Each of these situations requires the same fundamental capability those bomber gunners developed: the ability to recognize when instinct is wrong, the willingness to trust training and evidence over immediate perception, the discipline to execute counterintuitive actions under extreme stress. These aren't natural human capabilities. They must be trained, practiced, until they become automatic, reinforced through repetition until the unnatural becomes the new instinct. The position firing revolution also demonstrated something about institutional learning and adaptation. The Army Air Forces in 1942 had gunnery training based on decades of marksmanship doctrine. They had standard procedures, training manuals, established schools. When combat revealed those methods were fatally flawed, the institution faced a choice. They could defend existing doctrine, dismiss contrary evidence, continue doing what they'd always done, or they could acknowledge failure, embrace radical change, overturn decades of accepted practice. To their credit, the Army Air Forces chose adaptation. Not immediately, not without resistance from officers invested in traditional methods. But by mid-1943, position firing was official doctrine. Training materials were rewritten. Schools were reorganized. Thousands of instructors had to unlearn what they'd been teaching and master a new approach that violated everything they'd previously believed correct. This institutional flexibility, the willingness to abandon failed doctrine when evidence demanded it, contributed as much to Allied victory as any weapon system or tactical innovation. Compare this to institutions that refused to adapt. The Japanese Navy, for example, never developed computing gun sights comparable to American systems. Japanese aerial gunnery training remained relatively static throughout the war. Japanese fighters maintained their advantages in maneuverability and experienced pilots through 1943, but as those advantages eroded, Japanese defensive doctrine didn't evolve to compensate. By 1945, American bomber formations with well-trained gunners using position firing techniques could often fight their way through Japanese fighter opposition with acceptable losses, while early in the war, similar formations would have been devastated. The human cost of the learning curve remains sobering. Between December 1941 and July 1943, before position firing became standard training, The Army Air Forces lost thousands of bomber crewmen over both Europe and the Pacific. Some percentage of those casualties, impossible to calculate precisely, but certainly measured in hundreds, died because their gunners couldn't hit attacking fighters. Because training doctrine was wrong, because institutional inertia delayed adoption of methods that combat experience showed were necessary. Every innovation in military history carries this cost. The learning curve is written in blood, but the position firing revolution stands out because the solution wasn't technological or industrial. America didn't need to build better guns or faster bombers. The solution was conceptual, understanding physics and training humans to act against instinct. The tools already existed. The aircraft, the guns, the ammunition were all adequate. What was needed was correct doctrine and proper training. Once those were in place, the same gunners in the same aircraft with the same weapons became 3 to 5 times more effective. Staff Sergeant Robert Hayes, the instructor at Las Vegas who first articulated position firing principles, never received significant recognition during the war. He wasn't promoted to officer rank. He didn't receive medals for his contribution. He spent the war training gunners in Nevada, never deployed to combat theaters. But the method he developed saved thousands of lives. Bomber crews who survived missions because their gunners could actually hit attacking fighters owed their lives to Hayes's insight and Colonel Garland's willingness to test unconventional ideas. After the war, Hayes returned to civilian life in Montana. He worked as a high school physics teacher for 37 years. In an interview conducted in 1982, when he was 70 years old, he was asked whether he thought his contribution to position firing doctrine had been properly recognized. His response was characteristically modest. "I just did the math and ran some tests. Other instructors figured out how to teach it effectively. The real heroes were the kids who had to use it in combat, who had to aim at empty air while fighters attacked them. They're the ones who deserve credit. They're the ones who proved that humans can overcome instinct when survival requires it." Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.